We know that after Jesus' resurrection, the apostles began spreading the message of the gospel and how the retelling of these stories happened through oral transmission. As time went on, these stories were written down. Letters were circulated which discussed matters of faith. In this video, we look at the written transmission of those documents which came to us as the New Testament. Scholars place the death of Jesus at roughly 30 CE. Shortly after, the apostles go out and begin their spreading of the good news. In roughly 36 CE, Paul, a well-known and feared persecutor of the early followers of Jesus, has an extraordinary experience and joins the apostles in spreading the gospel. He sets out on missionary journeys, which we will read about in the Acts of the Apostles. And during these journeys, he establishes house churches, groups of followers who convert and become followers of Jesus. And he keeps in touch with these groups by means of letter. Our earliest of the Pauline letters dates to about 50 CE, and we have others that were written between that time and Paul's martyrdom in Rome in roughly 67. So between 64 and 67, both Peter and Paul have been martyred, as have some of the other apostles. And it becomes clear to these early Christians that Jesus' return was not going to happen as quickly as they thought. The loss of these key eyewitnesses and the increase in members gives rise to the need to have written accounts. Our first gospel to be put in writing is held by most scholars to be the Gospel of Mark, written sometime before or possibly very shortly after the fall of the temple in 70 CE. Most date this gospel as 68 CE, but some scholars will date it as late as 73. The Gospels of Matthew and Luke are dated around 80 to 90 CE, with the Gospel of John written somewhere between 85 to 95 CE. These writings then circulated around along with letters to be read when the communities gathered together for worship and celebration of the Eucharistic meal. As these writings circulated, copies would be made. And these copies were made by hand until the invention of the printing press in 1436. You will recall that the New Testament was written in Koine Greek, Common Greek. Right? Today, we have approximately 5,800 copies of manuscripts of the New Testament in Greek alone, some fragments dating back as early as the 2nd century. Add to that the copies made in other ancient languages, such as those shown in this chart, like Armenian, Coptic, Ethiopian, Latin, Slavic, and Syriac, and that number increases to about 27,000 copies of manuscripts of the New Testament. To get a good understanding of just how many that is, let's take a look at how these numbers stack up against other ancient writers. You can see that we have way more of the New Testament than any other piece of ancient writing. In fact, if you really want to know how this stacks up, Dan Wallace says that if you took all of the copies that we have of the New Testament and stacked them up, we'd have over a mile of New Testament manuscripts versus 4 feet of all of the other ancient writers combined. Now, the problem with handwritten copies is that they are prone to errors. Given the sheer number of manuscripts that we have, we shouldn't be surprised to learn that there are a great number of variations to be found between the copies. Dan Wallace refers to this as an embarrassment of riches. We have so many variants between the manuscripts because so many copies had been made. Let's take a quick look at what the written papyrus looks like to get a sense of what our scribes were up against. Here we have an image of the 4th century manuscript P75. The fragment that we're looking at shows the Gospel of Luke, chapter 8, verses 16 through 25. What do you notice? First, it's not written in English. This is Greek. It's written in all capital letters. There are no spaces, no punctuation, no chapter or verse numbers, no subtitles. If this had been written in English, it might look something like this. What we have today looks more like this, divided neatly into chapters and verses with subtitles. The Bible was divided into chapters by Stephen Langton in 1227, and the verse numbering wasn't added until 1551 by Robert Stephanus. Given the way in which the texts were written, variants were easy to happen. Many look like the type of examples that we see here. Can you spot the mistake? It's easy for your eyes to skip over and not notice the two occurrences of the word "the" in the first sentence. This is similar to the types of errors that occur when two lines of a text look the same, and it's easy then to skip a line. How about this one? Did you notice the missing word "to" between the words "not" and "be"? Or did you automatically insert it when you read it because the phrase is just so familiar to you? This type of error is known as the assimilation of parallels. We take something and conform it to something we're already familiar with. Both these types of errors are unintentional. Bear in mind also that if you're writing on papyrus, you don't get to backspace or to turn your pencil over and erase and write over it. Other causes of unintentional scribal errors can be that the scribe had poor eyesight or poor hearing and really didn't hear what was being said, or the lack of familiarity with the language. Other types of errors were more intentional. Some of the other challenges that our scribes faced were due to some of the nuances in the Greek language itself. For example, Greek did not have any conventional spelling, so sometimes a scribe would try to correct the spelling of a word or bring the spelling up to date. Then there's the fact that in Greek you have several ways to say the same thing. Here we have 16 Greek sentences, all of which translate to "Jesus loves Paul." Now, while some corrections that scribes made were to omit something that might not have seemed correct to the scribe, the intentional changes were mostly to modernize spellings or to supplement a text with some explanatory phrases that the scribe felt would help clarify things. According to Dan Wallace, we have an average of 2.5 variants per word found in the New Testament. That's a lot of variances. How do scholars decide which reading is most likely original? Scholars use two basic tools: internal evidence and external evidence. Internal evidence looks at the text and asks which reading best explains the others. Then there is the external evidence, which looks for the reading based on the earliest manuscripts, and it also takes into account how widespread geographically a particular reading can be found. An example that we have comes back from two manuscripts that we have that date to the 4th century. P75, which we looked at a little while ago, and another 4th century manuscript known as Codex Sinaiticus. Clearly these were not copied from each other, but yet a comparison between the two show that they agree greatly. So let's take a look at the nature of these variants that we have. Let's take a look at the nature of these variants. Now, the nature of these variants can be described as, first, whether or not it is meaningful. That is, the variant changes the meaning of the text. And secondly, whether or not it is viable. In other words, what is the probability that this variant goes back to the original manuscript? This then gives us 4 categories into which a variant can be classified. The first category is that the variant is neither meaningful nor viable. The second is that it isn't meaningful, but it could potentially go back to the wording of the original manuscripts. And these mostly are spelling differences. So the first two categories we lump together, and the majority of the variants that we find fall into these two categories. They tend to be things like spelling errors. The third category would be those variants which probably don't go back to the original, but are meaningful. So when we say that they're not viable, it's because maybe they're found in one very late manuscript. We have an example of this in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 7, where the word in Greek is different by one letter, and the translation then becomes, we were gentle among you versus we were little children. So it can be meaningful in that. Let's look at the second translation. It would read something like this. Instead, we were like young children among you, just as nursing mothers. That doesn't really make much sense, does it? So chances are that that didn't go back to the original wording. However, you could take that, you could say, instead we were like young children among you, put a hard stop, just as a nursing mother cares for her children, and that might make it a little bit more meaningful. So it's a bit of a puzzle for text scholars to try and determine whether or not this goes back to the original wording of the manuscript. But they will, again, they look at the external evidence, they only see it in one, and so they would say that the probability is not high that this goes back to the original. Our last category then are those variants which are both meaningful and viable. The two examples that I provide you here are from the Gospel of John, which is the story of the woman caught in adultery, and the last 12 verses of the Gospel of Mark. Our earliest manuscripts that have the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of John don't have these two particular passages. In fact, the story of the woman caught in adultery in some of our earlier manuscripts are found in John. Some of them even find it in Luke. It kind of moves around a bit. So it's possible that this is in the original, but we cannot know for certain. So what is the percentage of these categories that our variants fall into? Right? 75% of the variants that we have come out to be spelling differences. They are in categories 1 and 2. They're neither meaningful nor viable. They're not meaningful but may be viable. They're those types of errors that we talked about as being spelling differences or unintentional scribal changes. The third category, where they are, chances are not going back to the original but are still meaningful, make up about 24% of the textual variants that we have. The category 4s are less than 1%. And the two that we've listed, the one from John and the one from Mark, are really the two big ones. So, what impact does this have on any of our theological beliefs? None. None of the variants that we have any impact on our theological beliefs in Christianity.